Good morning, everyone. Today we will discuss the current affairs for 22nd January 2026. So let's start. First, let's discuss the news about the Diego Garcia base in Chagos Island. So, what is the news? The news says that the US president has recently criticized the UK government's move to transfer this island back to Mauritius. So, let's first understand the history of Diego Garcia. Essentially, Diego Garcia is a coral atoll in the central Indian Ocean. It was discovered by the Portuguese in the 15th century, and then in 1645, this island was transferred as part of the British Indian Ocean Territory to the UK. They used it for coconut plantation till the 1970s for several years, and around that time, through a 1971 agreement, they transferred this to the US to construct a military base in an island known as Diego Garcia, which is part of the Chagos archipelago. It is in the central Indian Ocean, as you can see. It is very close to the coast of India, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. Now, what is the importance of this base? This base is what has allowed the US to carry out its military operations in the entire Indian Ocean region. That includes the 1990 Gulf War, the Afghan strikes in 2001, and the 2003 Iraq invasion by the US. However, in the 1990s, the islanders who had been forcefully removed from the Chagos Islands started petitioning the courts in the UK to return them back to the islands. Various rulings by the courts in UK said that this removal was forceful and illegal, and the islanders have full right to return back to the Chagos archipelago. In 2024, an agreement was finally transferred between Mauritius and the UK government to return Chagos Island back to the UK. However, it also said that Diego Garcia will be retained with the UK and the US for military operations. Now let's come to the next news item. Earth experienced its strongest solar flare in 20 years on 18th to 19th January. तो पहले समझते हैं कि सोलर फ्लेयर्स क्या होते हैं. Solar flare जो ये वाला था, it has been ranked at S4, which is a severe category on the official space weather scale. And its interaction with the Earth's magnetic field results in the creation of aurora, which are even visible in latitudes further away from the poles. But these events can disrupt satellite electronics, GPS navigation, and energy grids. तो पहले समझते हैं कि सोलर स्टॉर्म होता क्या है. Solar storm होता है due to the sunspot activity on the sun's atmosphere. So what happens is, because the sun is essentially a hot burning mass, it creates a huge magnetic field because of this dynamo effect. But on its surface, there are certain localized spots where magnetic activity is more intense than the surrounding areas. These spots are what is known as sunspots, and the sun usually has an 11-year cycle. At the solar maximum, which is basically happening right now, sunspot activity is at its maximum. Now, when sunspot activity is at its maximum, the sunspots become magnetically unstable. And because of this instability, sometimes they warp and release massive amounts of plasma or ionized matter out into space. And this is known as a solar flare. Sometimes these solar flares are also accompanied by ionized particles, which are known as coronal mass ejections. Now let's understand how does this affect the Earth. These solar flares interact with the Earth's magnetic field. As we know that the Earth's core contains very hot material made up of iron and nickel, which are magnetic in nature. Because of this, it creates the magnetic field or the Van Allen belts. With this interaction, the particle radiation is sent spiraling along the field lines of Earth's magnetic field. First, it produces various aurora, as we saw. Second, it disrupts the ionosphere and the ionized particles in the top layer of our own atmosphere, which in turn disrupts any kind of radio frequency based communications. So that will affect GPS, satellite communications. Second, it can also induce currents in our power lines. And when that happens, it can shock transformers and lead to power outages. An example of this is called the Carrington event. In 1869, a massive solar flare led to something called the Carrington event, in which all the telegraph lines across the world were disrupted. Now, as we know that in 2023, India launched its own solar observatory known as Aditya L1. And Aditya L1 is now positioned as the unique opportunity in time to study the sun and its surface, especially now because we are in a solar maximum activity cycle. Aditya L1 was launched in 2023. It is India's mission to study the sun, and it is placed at Lagrange point 1. Let's quickly understand what is a Lagrange point. We know that objects in space exert gravitational force. This gravitational force leads to objects being attracted towards the object exerting that force. But at Lagrange points, the gravity exerted by the Earth on objects in space and that exerted by the Sun is balanced. So that object is at a unique equilibrium and does not have to expend too much energy to stay in that position. Lagrange point 1 is unique because it offers an unhindered and unobstructed view of the Sun 24/7. Now let's study about the draft National Electric Policy of 2026. First, let's understand why is this important. Electricity is a concurrent list subject, so that both center and states can regulate it. This policy will replace the 2005 policy, which governed the electricity sector. And right now, we see that the electricity sector and landscape in India is changing, so that a new policy is much needed. So, if you look at the last 20 years, we see that there has been a fourfold rise in the installed capacity for electricity generation in India. We've also achieved universal electrification in 2021. The per capita availability and consumption has also risen. And particularly, the share of renewables has surged. And they now have more than 50% of the total capacity of our installed energy capacity. Problem. Let's see what is still the problem. We know that in electricity, there's something called the cross subsidization policy. Cross subsidization simply means that for any commodity which is not viable to be sold at existing prices to consumers, you sell it at a higher price to one set of consumers and at a lower price to another set of consumers, so that the profits in one segment subsidize the losses in the second segment. In India, we charge lower tariffs for domestic and agriculture users, and we subsidize them by selling electricity at much higher prices to manufacturing sectors. Now, what does this do? First of all, this subsidy burden is borne by the distribution companies. These distribution companies then recover that subsidy burden from state governments. However, the problem is this, that results in a huge fiscal burden on state governments as that subsidy burden rises. They in turn delay payments to discoms. When payments to discoms are delayed, they actually have to go to the market and borrow money to cover that difference so that they can actually cover their operating costs. This results in financial distress on the discom. This distress then travels upstream because now they delay payments to the transmitting companies as well as to the production companies who actually produce the electricity, who are known as generating companies or GENCOs. What is the result? This sector runs on accumulating losses. When there are losses in a sector, they don't have any money left for any further expansion or investment. India has some of the highest transmission and distribution losses. That is, from the point of production of the electricity to its distribution to the final consumer. How much of that electricity is lost in the process? That is what is known as T&D losses at 17%. These are some of the highest in the world. Next problem is that even though our capacity to generate energy from renewables has increased, but we are not able to actually generate that much electricity. Why? Because we know that renewables are intermittent in nature. When the sun shines or when the wind blows, we can generate electricity. But in the remaining time, let's say at night, we cannot directly generate energy. We need to store the excess energy of the day in some form and then use it at night. But that is only possible if we have adequate storage capacity to match how much of installed capacity we have of the renewable grid. That is only 5%. And because of that, even though renewables are more than 50% of the installed capacity, but their generation is much lower than 50%. This is not a new problem. It has been in the news for quite some time, and it has saddled distribution companies and state governments in losses and debt for a long while. So, because of that, various policies have been launched by the central government. First was the Electricity Act of 2003. Now, what did this do? It created independent regulators. The job of the independent regulators was to fix tariffs independent of populist pressures from state governments, create competition by giving licenses for distribution to multiple companies in the same area, and that would result in greater efficiency in operations. However, this has not largely worked because regulators, especially the state regulators, are independent only in paper, and distribution continues to stay monopolized largely in the hands of state distribution companies and not any private distributors. Second, the government bought in the Ujjwal Discom Assurance Yojana, or UDAY. UDAY essentially said that, see, discoms have been saddled with debt. Let's take their debt and then transfer it on the books of the state governments so that they are able to then borrow fresh, and this renews the entire power sector pipeline. However, this is again a short term fix because the problem again escalates when losses come back due to subsidies. Then the government brought in what is called the revamped distribution sector schemes. Now, this scheme was contingent upon state governments initiating reforms by updating tariffs that are charged to consumers for electricity, smart metering, that is, households pay for that many units of electricity that they actually consume. However, this, as we know, has also remained largely in limbo, with many state governments not introducing these reforms. So, now, in order to address this, let's see what are the changes which have been proposed in this new electricity policy. First, the policy says that there should be annual tariff revision which is linked to some index, let's say a cost index, which will kick in automatically even if the state regulator does not hike the tariffs by themselves. Exemptions from cross subsidy burden for manufacturing, railways, and metros in order to make them more competitive and make India's manufacturing more competitive. Because we know that the cost of doing business in India is very high, and one of the reasons for that is the very high tariffs that they pay for electricity. Third, market based deployment of storage like battery and pumped hydro, supported by incentives in order to address the problem of storage for renewable electricity. Third, allowing consumers to trade surplus power from distributed renewable energy projects. What does this mean? Let's say that I am a consumer. I have an electricity line from my local discom, but I also have a huge solar plant from which I produce my own electricity. In at a certain time, if my consumption of electricity is lower than what I actually produce from my solar farm, I can sell that excess that I produce back to the grid. This is what is called sale of surplus power by consumers. Sharing of distribution system to increase competition and efficiency. Now, what happens right now is that we only have one distribution company in a city or in a village or in a district who supplies to the entire geography. With a shared distribution system, this is what we can have: common electricity line, which can be used for distribution, but multiple distributing companies who can lease this architecture to sell to consumers. What this will do is bring in more operators, greater competition, and possibly more efficiency in distribution, and perhaps giving a better deal to consumers. Now, let's look at the next topic. We know that a lot of news has been coming in from recent months about the decline in foreign direct investment flows. A recent RBI report says that in November of 2025, net FDI flows have been negative for the third straight month, or there have been net outflows for the third straight month. Now, what are the relevant topics for us here? FDI, what is its role for the economy? How does it affect the exchange rate? And why are net outflows a concern for India? Now, let's first understand what is foreign direct investment. तो foreign direct investment जो होती है, that is essentially a form of productive investment coming in from foreign investors. In our country's balance of payments framework, there are two segments. The current account, जिसमें हमारा ट्रेड बैलेंस रिफ्लेक्ट होता है कि जो हम एक्सपोर्ट करते हैं और इंपोर्ट करते हैं गुड्स एंड सर्विसेज का, उसका बैलेंस क्या है. कैपिटल अकाउंट, that is all flows that affect our asset liability position. कैपिटल अकाउंट में डायरेक्ट फ्लोज होते हैं, पोर्टफोलियो फ्लोज होते हैं, एक्सटर्नल कमर्शियल बोरोइंग्स होती हैं. डायरेक्ट फ्लोज which actually seek to invest in an enterprise and take a controlling stake so that they can use that enterprise to produce in India. Portfolio flows are primarily for investment purposes, for essentially share market investing and debt investing, and external borrowings are essentially loans. FDI के components देख लेते हैं. Any kind of shares, कॉमन स्टॉक शेयर या प्रेफरेंस शेयर, फुल्ली कन्वर्टेबल डिबेंचर. डिबेंचर एक डेट इंस्ट्रूमेंट होता है कंपनी में, एक तरह का लोन होता है, लेकिन अगर वो डिबेंचर एक कंडीशन के साथ आए कि मानो 5 साल में 7 साल में ये मैंडेटरीली कन्वर्ट हो जाएगा इनटू इक्विटी या कंपनी के शेयर्स में, तो उसको फुल्ली कन्वर्टेबल डिबेंचर्स कहा जाता है। लेकिन एफडीआई के लिए कंडीशन क्या होनी चाहिए कि उस कंपनी का कम से कम 10% शेयर कैपिटल should be the value of this FDI for it to qualify as FDI. It can either come through the automatic route or government route. What does this mean? In the automatic route, you do not need to seek special permission from the government to invest in this sector as a foreign investor. Under the government route, you need to actually seek the government's permission, particularly through the sector ministry. मान लो कि हम एक बैंक में इन्वेस्ट कर रहे हैं, प्लस द कॉमर्स मिनिस्ट्री। इंडिया में मोस्ट सेक्टर्स हैव बीन लिबरलाइज्ड फॉर सीकिंग एफडीआई। कुछ सेक्टर्स में सेक्टोरल कैप्स हैं, जैसे डिफेंस, बैंकिंग, न्यूक्लियर एनर्जी। नेट फ्लोज होते हैं द ग्रॉस इनफ्लोज माइनस द आउटफ्लोज। आउटफ्लो में क्या क्या आ सकता है? अगर इंडियन कंपनीज बाहर जाके दूसरे देशों की कंपनी में इन्वेस्ट करें, दैट इज पार्ट ऑफ आउटफ्लोज। अगर फॉरेन इन्वेस्टर्स अपना पैसा वापस लेके जाएं, मान लो उन्हें कुछ प्रॉफिट्स मिले हैं जिस कंपनी में उन्होंने इन्वेस्ट किया है उससे, एंड दे रिपैट्रिएटेड बैक टू देयर होम कंट्रीज, दैट इज ऑल्सो पार्ट ऑफ आउटफ्लोज। इफ दिस फिगर is negative, it constitutes as a net outflow. Now, why is FDI important? This is an example of various FDI companies in India to highlight to you the importance of them. Companies like Samsung, Apple, Hyundai, Toyota, Foxconn, all of them are here because of FDI and FDI liberalization. So first, it brings in greater competition in the market, where foreign players are able to enter the market, bring in better quality products, better priced products. In fact, sometimes altogether new categories, for example, iPhones. They can also play a role to boost exports if they make in India for foreign markets. For example, we know that Foxconn in India has played a major role to boost our exports of mobile phones in the last 5 years. Technology transfer. There could be certain industries where we do not have the technology in the first place. These players would not be willing to directly share that technology with another player because that is their intellectual property. But if we allow them to set up a unit here, they may be willing to transfer their technology to their Indian partner. It could create spillovers. How? It could create downstream industries and upstream industries. For example, let's think of what is an example of a downstream sector. If you have an automotive player like Hyundai, Hyundai requires various parts which it needs to make its cars. Now it needs to share its technologies and its requirements and quality requirements with Indian players and thus create downstream industries for auto parts. Upstream industries could be, for example, sales, IT, which are required in the upstream of the value chain of that industry. पर्टिकुलरली इंडिया के लिए एफडीआई और एफपीआई दोनों क्यों इंपॉर्टेंट है? हमें पता है कि जो हमारा करंट अकाउंट है उस पे ऑलमोस्ट 10-15 साल से हम एक डेफिसिट रन कर रहे हैं. व्हाट डज दैट मीन? इट सिंपली मीन्स दैट वी आर इम्पोर्टिंग अ लॉट मोर देन वी एक्सपोर्ट. इसका ये सिंपल मतलब है कि हमारा जो खर्चा है हमारी आमदनी से ज़्यादा है. अब बाकी का जो खर्चा है हमारी आमदनी के ऊपर उसको कवर करने के लिए हम एफडीआई और एफपीआई के पैसे का इस्तेमाल करते हैं. If FPI and FDI starts to fall or becomes negative, how will we cover this shortfall? That is a very important question, and that is why this topic has been in the news for almost 3 4 months. Now, if there are net outflows so that we are not able to cover our imports, we have two choices. Either we let the market automatically adjust. What is this automatic adjustment? Because now your demand for dollars is higher than your supply for dollars in the Indian market, it would mean that your rupee will lose value relative to the dollar. That is, it would depreciate. When the rupee depreciates, your imports become more expensive, your exports become cheaper for foreign buyers. As a result of that, your current account deficit will automatically adjust. Second option, you don't let your currency depreciate, or you don't let it depreciate as much. The RBI or the central bank intervenes to sell dollars. जितनी excess demand है dollars की उसको RBI service कर सकता है from its reserves, and it funds that excess demand. The rupee then remains stable, or at least doesn't depreciate by as much. The problem is that this has limitations. Even though we have the fourth largest foreign exchange reserves in the world, if our central bank on every occasion tries to use these reserves in order to support the rupee, these reserves will deplete ultimately, and there will be a limit to how much we'll be able to use them. Second, the reason that we've been able to accumulate these reserves is because of these very high FDI and FPI flows. So if they stop, the input into our reserves will be falling, and the output, that is what the RBI is doing by selling dollars, will keep on rising. It would essentially be like a bucket with a hole at the bottom and the tap being shut. That is all for today. Thank you so much.